The MENA Talks, a podcast series by the BIC on the Middle East and North Africa. Once a month, our hosts, along with special guests, will explore underlying historical, economic, social and political drivers behind today's systemic issues in the MENA region. The BIC is present on Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. Follow us and subscribe to receive our latest news and publications.
Welcome to this new episode of the MENA Talks. My name is Ben Lowings. I'm a political analyst at the Brussels International Centre. And today I'm grateful to be joined by Ms. Mirette Mabrouk, who is a senior fellow and director of the Egypt program at the Middle East Institute. And welcome to this discussion.
Thank you so much.
So today, water as a natural resource is increasingly under the political spotlight. It's not a new phenomenon. In 2012, under the Obama administration, the US's intelligence community assessed possible risks of water pressure around the world. While not mentioning states by name in this report, the Nile River was the first such region that was named on the abstract page of this report. Now, fast forward 9 years later, 2021, Nile water access is firmly in the political limelight with the recent controversies over Ethiopia's new mega dam, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or the GERD. Recently, the most recent of which controversies was when there was an angry reaction by Addis Ababa about a resolution proposed by the Arab League earlier this month under the request of Egypt and Sudan that said that they wanted the UN Security Council to intervene on the dispute. Now, Mirette, to start us off on this discussion, can you introduce some of the issues that are affecting the three countries and why has this become such a toxic political problem at the moment?
So this particular debate has been going on, the negotiations rather on this issue have been going on for well over a decade, but it dates back in far further than that. Actually, Ethiopia has been thinking and wanting to do a large dam, a mega dam for decades. And finally managed to scrape together the money. The dam is self-financed, and one of the reasons I think why Ethiopians feel so strongly about this dam is that it was built with their own money. And the dam is huge. It is a hydroelectric power dam. It is huge. The reservoir will hold more than the annual rainfall of the entire Nile basin. So it's immense. The problem is the decision to build the dam was taken unilaterally by Ethiopia. Egypt and Sudan were not consulted. Now, people might say, well, why should Egypt or Sudan be consulted on a dam that is built in Ethiopia with their own money on the river? And Ethiopia, of course, is the source for about 85% of one of the tributaries of the Nile, the Blue Nile. The problem is that dams affect downstream countries, and Egypt and Sudan are the two downstream countries, Egypt being the most downstream country. Now, back in 2015, there have been several Nile water treaties, and there's a huge amount of sort of fallacy and discrepancy, and in Ethiopia has accused Egypt and Sudan of leaning on colonial era agreements, and it's I think when the discussion is being had, there's been the idea floated that Egypt and Sudan are still essentially colonial powers. The thing is, that's not quite true. In fact, it isn't at all true in the sense that there were several treaties that people point to. The 1902 treaty, which was signed by Ethiopia and Egypt, when, of course, Egypt was a protectorate, but Ethiopia was an empire. And then there was another treaty in 1993. And in the middle, there was the 1959 agreement, which was signed with Egypt and Sudan, which accorded Egypt about 55 billion cubic meters annually, and Sudan about 18 billion cubic meters annually. And there's often the case made that this treaty contains a veto on upstream projects. It's not true. It does not contain a veto. And That's really not surprising because Ethiopia neither signed this agreement, it's not a party to it, it does not recognize it, so I'm not sure why anyone thinks that a veto would be of any use whatsoever. But in any case, all of that is fairly irrelevant because the only treaty on the table being discussed for the purposes of talks on the GERD is the 2015 Declaration of Principles that was signed by Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. And essentially that said everyone's going to work together without harming the interests of, the other parties. The problem was when GERD was built, it was built unilaterally, and it is the only dam of its kind in the world that was built without an ESIA. An ESIA is an environmental and sustainability impact assessment, and that is that's a study that assesses the effect of a dam on the downstream countries. That was never done. Ethiopia refused to have one done. There was a report publicly available in 2013 by an international panel of experts, and I think Ethiopia did not provide all the documents required, and essentially, really, that international panel of experts report has been fairly shelved. So no one has any idea what effect this dam is going to have on Egypt and Sudan. However, one can take several fairly educated guesses because this is not, the problems on this dam they're not technical. All right. Between them, these three countries have more than enough expertise to be able to sort out any issues with this dam. The problems are political. They are not technical. And you have to bear in mind that under normal circumstances, there might be no problem to the downstream countries from this dam at all. In fact, there could very well be serious advantages, especially for Sudan, which is in the middle and is very, very badly affected by Nile flooding when it happens. And one of the advantages of the dam, of course, is that it does regulate water flow and would regulate flooding, and of course would wind up producing electricity, which Sudan might benefit from. So I mean, really, it's a huge shame because this dam had the potential to be a source of enormous cooperation and mutual benefit, because during the discussions, I mean, Egypt did offer Ethiopia the opportunity to use Egypt's significantly more advanced electricity grid, because Ethiopia has said that it is producing electricity that it wants to sell to better itself. It is important for Ethiopia's development. And Egypt offered Ethiopia the opportunity of selling not just to neighboring countries, but to selling to Europe and to Asia and to the Gulf, via Egypt's network. Ethiopia refused. Now, you could say that Ethiopia wanted to complete independence, did not trust the Egyptians, but that's what international agreements are for. But in any case, the problem has become enormously contentious because there are two sticking points. Yeah, Egypt and Sudan want a legally binding agreement on what's going to happen with this dam, how it's going to be run, how much water will be released. And they want a dispute mechanism in case anything goes wrong. Ethiopia refuses. Ethiopia has said that Egypt and Sudan will have to take its word that it will behave in an appropriate manner without causing them harm. The harm referred to here would be what happens when there is a drought or there is a water shortage. This is a hydroelectric dam. That water is used to produce electricity. If there is less water, then you can produce less electricity. Then they would still need to hold water back, hold increasing amounts. It isn't increasing, but when there's a water shortage, there's less water. And therefore, the amount of water that you hold back has more of an effect on downstream countries. And it could be disastrous for Egypt and for Sudan. Sudan is 50% desert. Egypt is 96% desert. The United Nations places water shortage, extreme water scarcity at about 1,000 cubic meters of water per annum. Per person. Egypt's already at 570. So Egypt is already one of the most water-starved nations in the world, and it has a population that is increasing by leaps and bounds. In fact, Egypt represents about 20% of all of the populations of all Nile Basin countries. The only other country actually that matches it in size is Ethiopia, which has slightly less people, but not much. I think it's about just under 100 million. So the consequences for Egypt would be it is difficult to overestimate. It is difficult to overstate how disastrous this would be for Egypt in terms of drought, because the thing with drought is there is no such thing as a 1 year drought. 1 year drought is a bad year. Droughts tend to go on for several years. The US is currently facing its second drought in a large part of the country through California, Arizona, Texas. And the last drought, which had taken, I don't know, about 5-6 years, just finished in 2017, and it's starting all over again. And we are going to see more and more of these extreme weather patterns thanks to climate change.
Wow, that's a great overview of many of the key issues so far. I think we will eventually touch upon some of these possible aspects of cooperation a bit later. I think we can come back to that. But for now, we've spoke a little bit about some of the treaties that are already in place, especially this 2015 Declaration of Principles. One of the key aspects of this current dispute is the negotiation process, the current mediation process under the African Union. Now, of course, this has not been just this year. This has been a few years now, originally under South Africa and now currently under the leadership of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the most recent talks of which happened in Kinshasa in April of this year. Now, according to all sides, there's reasons why these talks didn't bear fruit, but nothing's happened so far. So what do you make of these current talks? Is this a realistic thing to see any sort of result from them in the near future even?
That's a good question. I think the reflexive answer, unfortunately, would be unless something drastic changes on the ground, no, we don't expect to see anything else. I do think that perhaps the Sudanese Minister of Irrigation put it best. He said that at one point he said they were withdrawing from the talks because they were going round and round in circles. They had seen absolutely no fruit whatsoever, and the African Union had failed in its role as a mediator. It may be harsh to say that the African Union failed. The problem is, during negotiations, there have to be things on the table that people want, and truth be told, Ethiopia holds most of the cards. And I think one of the reasons why Ethiopia had consistently refused any international participation in these talks. It insisted that the talks be only tripartite, and that wasn't working for Egypt and Sudan because they thought they kept having the same conversations over and over, and there was no recourse. So Ethiopia had demanded the African Union because they said it was an African problem and it should be solved in Africa. And of course, it's true, it is an African problem. It would be wonderful if it was solved in Africa. And the problem is that, to the best of my knowledge, the African Union has not had enormous success mediating any other similar conflicts. There was an attempt made by the Americans in 2020, last year, and it seemed to be bearing fruit, but then at the last minute, the Ethiopians pulled out. After there was an agreement on the table, the Ethiopians accused the Americans of being on the side of the Egyptians and Sudanese and pulled out. So that didn't work. Now, Sudan has led the call, heavily backed by Egypt, of course, to have talks mediated by an international quartet, the African Union, the EU, the US. It has, so far, Ethiopia has solidly refused. And the fact is, much of this lies with Ethiopia. Ethiopia holds most of the cards, the idea has got, again, in any negotiation, it has to be worth someone's time. In the case of Ethiopia, it does appear to be that there are other political issues at stake. Ethiopia is a vast country and immensely complex in many ways, but it's probably true to say that the dam was one of the few things that everyone in Ethiopia actually agreed on. At the moment, of course, Ethiopia is seeing some dreadful internal conflict with a terrible conflict happening in Tigray, which has actually brought down a lot of international condemnation on the head of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who holds a Nobel Prize for peacemaking, but seems to have tarnished his image somewhat. And there is increasing international concern over the situation in Tigray. The United Nations has sort of officially declared a famine up there. And he's consistently the Americans have recently said that they're going to impose sanctions. They're going to cut aid. No one knows how much aid is going to be cut because there are humanitarian issues that you can't touch. But unfortunately, it's extremely difficult to predict how external affairs will affect negotiations. It could be that Ethiopia will simply double down and say, hard cheese, this is what we're going to do. Or it could be in a position where it says, we are fighting way too many battles on way too many fronts. We don't need international intervention. In fact, it might be a good idea to pull in some, international some FDI, and we could walk away from this significantly better off.
I'm just going to jump in there because I feel with the current level of violence in Tigray, it's had a number of spillover effects to other parts of not just Ethiopia, but the wider region. And we can see this with the current tension in the Al-Fashaga region, which is a border between Sudan and Ethiopia, a border that for many years was just left messy, unfixed, really. And for a while, it seemed to be just one of those outstanding issues of international politics that people didn't touch or talk about. Suddenly, with the eruption of violence in Tigray in November, we have this escalation of rhetoric from the Sudanese side and the Ethiopian side towards each other on supposed conflations of sovereignty and amongst other sorts of things. Now, it's interesting that this happens in the context of these GERD negotiations because we have seen an increase in increasingly outspoken rhetoric by the Sudanese here. Do you see the same thing? What have you seen in terms of rhetoric from the three participants in the past year? So
I actually think that the Sudanese have become significantly more proactive. They have come into their own. I don't want to sound as if they hadn't been in their own before, but they have been very definite, very forceful about what they want, very forceful about what they don't want. Polite, which if you know the Sudanese is kind of a national trait. They're immensely polite people, polite but very, very forceful. The disputed region that you're referring to has, it's been like that for a while in the sense that it is sort of officially on the Sudanese side of the demarcation line, but it's sort of being settled by Ethiopian farmers. And as you pointed out, there was increasing violence in December and things sort of went to pot. What is more important in this particular case is that Egypt and Sudan now have a military pact, which they hadn't, and Egypt has publicly said that it is willing to support Sudan in case of an issue, which Ethiopia should want to bear in mind, because of course, when discussing what might happen about in this dispute, people have always asked, well, is it likely that there will be a military conflict? And the answer I always give is nobody wants a military conflict. It's bad for everybody. I think the Egyptian president a few months ago said, no one is going to touch a drop of our water, but he followed that up in the same sentence with, I think we should bear in mind that military conflicts are unpredictable. They have ugly consequences, and those consequences last for years. Nobody wants a military conflict. But one of the problems might be problematic is, of course, is that Egypt and Ethiopia aren't exactly next door. But if Egypt is supporting Sudan, then it is next door. So it is something that Ethiopia would probably want to bear in mind. So Sudan has become is very, very much a player. This is an interesting thing that people have tended overwhelmingly, I think more for dramatic purposes than anything else, tended to frame this as a conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia, while ignoring Sudan, which is quite literally in the middle. And Sudan absolutely should not be ignored. Sudan now holds a fair amount of the cards, and I think it's important to bear that in mind.
I want to return to something you said in your opening discussion points, which was about positive opportunities and ways that perhaps this source of national tension, shall we say, could be used for something more positive. Now, I view it in terms of what's the biggest problem, what's the biggest elephant in the room that isn't being discussed. And for me, one of those things is climate change, demographic change, water scarcity generally across the continent, desertification in large levels, which of course would be a problem with or without this dam. Now, do you see any ways for there to be a compromise that could be reached from a position of tackling a shared problem together, or is this not realistic?
Okay, so you raise a lot of issues, and there's sort of a Venn diagram with all of those issues, but there are parts that don't actually intersect. The dam is presented an opportunity for extremely profitable mutual cooperation in terms of profit and electricity, and just the fact that you have three fairly important countries in the region that are all working together, that presented enormous opportunities. Water scarcity is something that is going to that is already affecting the entire region, some countries more than others. The level of international cooperation, I think, hasn't been looked into that much, basically because many of the countries in the region are still struggling to cope with the changes that are coming. For example, Egypt is immensely aware of climate change and is working on reducing its water and all the rest of it, but is it still tackling it in the best way possible? Is there a structure there that will enable Egypt at the moment to take full advantage of its networks and be as proactive as possible? The answer is no. So, and even less so for Sudan, even less so for Ethiopia. It is one of these immense creeping threats that it's a little bit like watching a shark fin come out of the water. It's you can see the shark fin coming, but you can't actually, you have no idea how big that shark is, and until it bites you, there is this sort of sense that we know it's there, but we have to do something, but we don't have to do it just yet. So I think it's one of these problems that honestly needs to be tackled domestically rather than internationally first, not because intercountry cooperation isn't a good idea. It's just that the bigger problem is that individual countries aren't paying enough attention to it on their own, let alone in a larger, in a larger context.
Okay, so I come to my final point, and this is probably a brief one, but what do you think about the prospects for this year? I mean, the second filling of the reservoir is due to happen very soon in Ethiopia, and in my opinion, it's going to happen no matter what happens in any agreements or discussions. Ethiopia has already indicated that they will continue with the second filling no matter what happens. But do you see? Are there positive signs on the horizon? Can we be optimistic about this, or is this still a work in progress?
It's a work in progress in the sense that no one really knows what's going to happen, and people are still scrambling and firing on all cylinders. But there are a few things that could affect the outcome. One of them is the extremely upcoming Ethiopian elections. And it could be that once you have if Abiy Ahmed is re-elected, I mean, elections are going to be, I think, extremely dodgy under the circumstances. Extremely difficult to pull off. But I'm not on the ground doing this, so it's I can't even begin to imagine how they would do that. But these elections are coming up, and they will be. Someone is going to win, and if it's him, it could provide an outlet in that. This conflict has taken on extremely strident and in many cases ugly nationalistic overtones in all three of the countries concerned. All right. And in Ethiopia, the dam has been used to drum up nationalist feeling in perhaps a way that, obfuscates slightly on the other problems that the other country is having. So it could be that if he does win this election, then that political respite would put him in a position where he can come up with a compromise that he can sell as something potentially useful, as a win-win for Ethiopia. And definitely a deal on the dam would be a win-win for Ethiopia, because whatever Ethiopia is going to get out of the dam on its own, you're going to triple or quadruple that if it goes in with partners and with all of the financial and international support that would come with an agreement of that, because there are people who want it to succeed. So there is that. You are quite right. The second filling of the dam is going to happen. Nobody thinks it isn't going to happen, although the Ethiopians have said that they have technical and construction issues, so they might not be withholding as much water as they thought they might. No one really knows. But then they've also said that they're going to build about 100 more medium-sized and small-sized dams in the country, which does not bode well, but one hopes that it is sort of pre-election, faffle. If all of these countries get involved, and there has been also talk from the Gulf countries. You have to remember that the Gulf countries are heavily invested in all three of these countries. They have horses in every race, and therefore the Ethiopians might actually listen to them. There are reasons to hope that people are not going to let this spiral out of control. Okay, because it really does have the potential to get very ugly. So there are reasons to hope that people will not let this spiral out of control. But more importantly, I do think people need to stop looking at it as an isolated incident in Africa. Transboundary issues are an international problem. They're going to become an issue for everybody, even countries that think that they have a lot of water. That's not really the case. So the sooner there are international mechanisms in place to tackle problems like this, the better it will be for everybody. And you might think that it's not your problem at the moment, but it's going to become your problem. So the smart thing to do would be use this as a kind of template.
Well, on that note, I think that's a good place to wrap up our discussion. It is crucial, I believe, as well, for some lessons to be learned from this discussion, no matter what they are, and hopefully the international community can take something positive out of this, and hopefully something that works for the citizens more than anything across all three countries. I will leave it there. Thank you so much, Mirette, for joining me today.
You're very welcome.
It was a very interesting discussion. You're most welcome as well. It was a very interesting discussion and so many things to talk about, but it just goes to show how many factors there are involved in this that's often very simplified in just a quick article online or something like this. So it's very good that we have these discussions and debates. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to any of you that are listening to this, and I hope that you can join us again for another episode of the MENA Talks.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the MENA Talks. Share your thoughts with us on social media with the hashtag MENA Talks, and follow us to receive our latest news and updates. The MENA Talks is a podcast series on the Middle East and North Africa, an initiative of the Brussels International Centre.